Now to Chapter 8. This chapter is on texture. When we think about texture, we think about how something feels, perhaps, or what something is made of. For example, if I had on a wool sweater, I would think that the texture of that wool is slightly scratchy, thick, but soft. How does texture then relate to music, since you can't necessarily feel what music feels like? Music texture refers to how many different layers of sound are heard at once. So it is similar to how you think of feeling a texture. When you think of that wool sweater and what it feels like, you're feeling a softness on the outer layer, you're feeling the thickness of the actual material, and you're feeling the scratchiness that the actual material is made from. So, in music, when we talk about texture, we talk about the layers of sound that we hear. We talk about how those different layers relate to one another. Does a piece of music have one melody all by itself? Does it have 3 or 4 melodies all happening at the same time? Does it have melody and harmony? So, of course, we're also asking the question, what kind of layers are we combining to create that music? In other words, how are melody and harmony related, and how are we combining them? There are 3 types of texture: monophony, polyphony, and homophony. Monophony is our first type of texture we talk about. Monophonic music, or a monophonic texture, is a single melodic line without any accompaniment. Please note that when I use the word accompaniment, I mean harmony. It's simply another way that musicians use to describe harmony. Because remember, harmony is something that supports a melody. It is something that accompanies a melody. That is why we use the word accompaniment to replace harmony sometimes. Some examples of monophonic music or monophonic texture are Gregorian chant, a very old type of church chant in which a melody is created using a single human voice or a choir of voices all on the same pitch, singing one single line melody. Another example is solo instrumental music. I'm sure some of you have heard popular artists start out with a simple melody on one of the instruments that they play, such as guitar. Another example of that would be the cello suites by J.S. Bach, a Baroque composer we'll talk about next week. Look them up if you'd like to know what they sound like. But it's an instrument playing a single melodic line by itself, that's just all by itself creating the music. Let's listen to an example of chant so that you get an idea of what that type of music sounds like. That particular song is a piece of music written by an abbess, or a nun, named Hildegard von Bingen. That piece of music lasts 1 hour and 16 minutes. So just think, that's what people used to listen to. That was all that was allowed because church music was what was important in the world, and it had a very tight control on what people listened to. They believed that music with harmony was sinful because it was too complicated, and it required more than just a single voice to produce it. On to polyphony. Polyphony is when you have a simultaneous performance of 2 or more melodic lines. In other words, you have 2 or more melodies that have equal importance being performed at the same time. Polyphony literally means having many sounds. So let's talk about a couple examples. First, we have fugues. These were the first polyphonic compositions ever to be written. These were written during the Baroque period when the church had finally decided that melody was still the essence of music, but sometimes you needed to support it with something else. They still thought that harmony was a little bit sinful, so they decided instead to come up with this new type of music where you could use 2 or 3 or 4 melodies all at the same time to create more complex sounds. So again, this is music that started in the church and went from there. We're going to listen to a fugue in just a second, based off of a very popular song by Lady Gaga. So hold on to that thought for just a second while I describe what a round is. A round is another type of polyphony, but it's a much more simple type. It's something that we sang as children. It's when you have one melody that's sung at multiple times. So for example, in your book they use Row, Row, Row Your Boat. They show you that if someone starts singing at the first second of a song, but the next person starts that same melody at the third second of a song, and then another voice would start singing at like the fifth second of a song, you have 3 melodies happening simultaneously. Most of the time, these types of melodies in polyphony are written so that when they occur at these different times, all sounding at the same time, they sound beautiful together. Complicated, but beautiful. There are pieces of music that are written in a polyphonic style that don't necessarily sound good. They're meant to sound complicated and very hard to listen to because they don't necessarily sound like anything that's comfortable to hear. But most polyphony, even though it's complicated, is really beautiful because it's a way to create music out of multiple single-line melodies. So let's listen to that example of the Lady Gaga song written as a fugue. I'll try and point out where the different melody lines begin. So here's melody number 1. Here's melody number 2. Right now, melody number 2 is going to continue over top of an ornamented form of melody number 1. There's melody number 3. Now you can hear that there are 3 parts going at the exact same time. Here's the melody one more time. There it is again, this time being imitated at a much faster pace. So can you hear how complicated the music sounds when you try to create melody over melody over melody instead of using melody and harmony together? There are chords created with these particular melodies when they combine together, but these chords are not making a progression. They're not creating a pattern that creates harmony. All they're doing is happening because you have certain melodies aligning with other melodies to create groups of tones. But when you're listening, hopefully you're hearing that every melody has a single line that continues. It's not about the combination of sound, it's about the different melodies happening at different times. Now, homophony is something we're all familiar with, even if you don't know it already. It's the most common musical texture. Homophonic music, or homophonic texture, is when you have a melody that is accompanied by a chord progression. In other words, it's when you have a melody and harmony that combine to make a piece of music. A few examples. Most of the pop and folk songs that we listen to nowadays are a sung melody accompanied by an instrumental harmony line that supports that melody. So there's a single line melody and a chordal accompaniment. Those two things combined make a homophonic texture. Another example for any of those who are Christian or go to a church is a church hymn. Most church hymns have a sung melody and an instrumental accompaniment if you go to modern churches where you have praise bands. But old-fashioned hymns, for anyone who goes to perhaps a Catholic church or to any sort of Protestant church, you're going to hear hymns that have a melody line that matches the rhythm of the harmony. In other words, the melody is still going to be sung, but the harmonies are going to be played right along with that in the exact same rhythmic patterns. That's just two examples. Homophony is everywhere. It surrounds us, and it's a common texture because of how stable and enjoyable it sounds to all of us. Let's think back to that Hey Jude song that we listened to before by the Beatles. Take another listen really quickly.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better.
Do you hear how the sung melody is a single line of tones, and it has underneath it an instrumental chordal accompaniment, or a chordal harmony progression? Those two things combined make our favorite texture, homophony. So what happens when you want to change the texture within one piece of music? Good things. Changing texture is very common in a song. You're going to hear it in popular music and in classical music. You hear it in everything. Textures are changed throughout pieces of music simply because composers and songwriters are looking for ways to capture an audience and keep their attention. This is where listening example 2 comes in. When you're listening to example 2, I want you to think about where the monophony, homophony, and polyphony occur. You can use page 48 of the text as a listening guide because it helps to identify the textures and when they happen. The piece of music that makes up listening example 2 is a farandole, a dance, from the L'Oraison Suite No. 2 by Georges Bizet. He was a Spanish composer who loved writing in a French style, so it's a very interesting mix of sounds. Listen for the two different melodies that he has, because remember, in order to create polyphony in a piece of music, you have to have more than one melody. Sometimes he has the entire ensemble playing one melody in different octaves, but every single pitch is the exact same pitch for every instrument. That's an example of monophony. Other times, he has chordal accompaniments happening underneath the two melodies that he has created. That's an example of homophony. And he also has polyphony when he combines the two different melodies to happen at exactly the same time. When you're listening to that section of the piece, hear how complicated it sounds, but hear how well the two melodies go together. The next thing we're going to talk about is musical form. So once you've listened to example 2 and you've thought about all these textures and also thought back to the other elements we've talked about, move on to the next video lecture.